From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. Imagine an idyllic little town, perched in the foot of the mountains by a roaring river with rows of wooden houses on stilts and an unlikely number of bars.
The bar that I worked in was sort of on its own little island. It sort of looks like a slum bar, and it has a huge sort of square rectangle where everyone can come around, and all the staff are inside serving the drinks and the drug menu if anyone wants that.
The what? The drug menu?
The menus, I remember, would always have weed, mushrooms, and opium. And you could have each one of them in your bucket, your free alcohol bucket that you would get. It would be whizzed up with a banana, which would probably be the most expensive part. Or you have something called the disco bucket, which was famous, which was everything in there mixed up. And it just looked like a big bucket of mud. And that's all free. And all the Westerners are sort of like, I can't believe this. And it's because it's their cheapest commodity, the alcohol there. It's all just made in the tin shed. And it costs absolutely nothing. The whiskey there, I remember, was $1, which is cheaper than the beer there.
This is Vang Vieng, a little town in Laos, which is a firm fixture on the modern Grand Tour, where young, carefree Westerners and gap year students come armed with backpacks and a desire to party. But partying here is like nothing they'll have ever experienced before.
No one's having an easy night, for sure. Everyone who's coming in is not having early nights. Everyone's getting probably the most on the spectrum of fucked up that you could get within Southeast Asia that I saw. People were getting a different kind of drunk there, for sure. But even people who weren't doing drugs. I think it was also the freeness of it. You know, we can't turn down free alcohol. You think it's precious to you. And I think it's sort of installed in you as a Westerner that, oh, I've been given a commodity here that's valuable. It doesn't matter if you want to drink or not, you better take it because it's like a waste. You know, you've been given free booze, especially as a teenager when you're on a budget. One bucket is just lethal.
It should have been the perfect holiday. But with 6 young tourists now dead, how did a night out in Vang Vieng go so wrong? The story today, inside the Laos party town where people die.
I'm Richard Lloyd Parry, the Asia editor of The Times and the Sunday Times.
Richard, have you been to Vang Vieng?
I have. I was there over the weekend for 1 night and 2 days. A rather intense and memorable 2 days.
I bet. What's it like? If you were to describe it to people who haven't been, what sort of a place is it?
Well, to anyone who has been backpacking, it will be very familiar. It's a classic backpacker town, but a very physically beautiful and striking one. So Laos is a very little known, rather obscure country in Southeast Asia. And I've not spent a lot of time there before. I'd only been there once before. You arrive in the capital, Vientiane, which is a rather sleepy, relatively modern Southeast Asian city. You take a road, used to be a very bad road, and then you get on a new, fast, Chinese-built motorway. It takes about an hour and a half. And you come off the motorway and you're in this really stunningly beautiful natural landscape of limestone cliffs. I mean, cliffs is not the right word. They're mountains, really, soaring up all around, grey limestone faced with tropical vegetation. And then this river running through it and this rather small town in the middle with local people running bars and hostels and a large number of mostly young, largely European backpackers.
And Richard, you were there covering this horrific tragedy. Just explain what happened.
Well, the facts are still coming out. A Laos police investigation is going on, but it seems fairly clear that on the 11th of November, which was a Monday, the evening was beginning in the town of Vang Vieng. And it was beginning in the normal way with the backpackers, the many backpackers who visit there were in their hostels ready for a night out in the bars and restaurants of the town. And in a lot of these hostels, not all of them, but a number of them, the evening begins in the same way with the barman giving free shots of vodka or whiskey to everyone who's there. So there's a party in the hostel every night, and it goes on until the early hours of the morning. There's a swimming pool, there's a bar, there's a pool table. It's like a kind of university JCR surrounded by limestone cliffs, tropical jungles, but with free booze, at least at the start of the evening. And this happens in a number of these places. In the Rana backpackers hostel, the shots were given out, people started to drink them, some people had more than one, and the evening went on. Now, not immediately, but the following day, some of those who had been present and who had drunk started to become ill, and some of them became very ill.
Last week, I got severe methanol poisoning from a hostel in Vang Vieng in Laos. We had a big table, about 10 people, and we were all sharing a bottle of locally sourced Lao vodka. It wasn't until 15 hours later that my symptoms started to kick in, which were extreme tiredness. I was practically asleep for a whole day. I was violently throwing up. I was really lucid. I had visual impairment, like I could barely see. It was just like bright lights. My boyfriend made a decision to take me to a private hospital in Vientiane, and the people there literally saved my life.
And on the 13th of November, in the early hours of the morning, 2 young Australian women, 19 years old, were taken by someone, I think by their friends, to the local hospital, which is just a few hundred yards away in this small town. And there, one of them was reeling and disoriented. She was put on a drip by the doctors, but she very soon, within half an hour, had a seizure and went into a coma. And at that point, the doctors in this small district hospital realized that this was really beyond their capabilities. And she was put in an ambulance and sent to the capital of Vientiane, where she died a few days later. By that time, 5 other people had died. 5 of those who died were young women. One of them was an American man of 57. And the toxicology reports from the hospitals in nearly all those cases showed that they died of poisoning by the chemical methanol.
How horrific. And Richard, just for a bit of context, I mean, these are shots they were given, free shots. This isn't something they've paid for. Is that normal in this part of the world?
It's normal in hostels like this at the beginning of the evening. And I think the fact they were free is probably part of the explanation for what happened, because these are businesses. They don't operate on big margins. To stay in that hostel, I think, cost about £4 or £5 a night. It's really cheap. So these shots were being given away, and one can assume that it was cheap stuff, very cheap stuff. And that may be the explanation as to why it was not only of such low quality, but had been contaminated with this deadly chemical.
And is this unusual? Because we've sort of heard very mixed reports about places like Vang Vieng. A lot of people do die, and you don't hear reports about it normally.
It's certainly unusual for 6 people to die essentially in one evening. And that's why we have heard about this, because these very young people, their parents, their families are devastated, their friends are posting on social media. That is extremely unusual.
Bountiful bouquets and flags flown at half-mast for 2 best friends who will never get to see the outpouring in their honour. A GoFundMe set up by the families of Holly Bowles and Bianca Jones has been steadily and rapidly climbing in donations to be used in their legacy.
To know that there is a good comes out of evil. That, I think, is possibly one of the only ways that you can grieve and make some sort of sense out of the tragedy that you were thrust upon.
Heavy drinking is part of the culture of this backpacker trail on which Vang Vieng lies. And cheap drinks are part of that culture too. And so are drugs. People tell you that some of these bars, semi-openly, I mean, not with much pretense of secrecy, sell methamphetamine, opium, even magic mushrooms, things like that, MDMA. So it would be surprising if this sort of thing didn't happen more often. I did talk to one of the doctors at the hospital where these unfortunate people were treated when they first got sick. And I said this to him, had you ever seen methanol poisoning before? And he said, no, in 30 years, I've never seen it before. Now, to be honest, I'm not sure if he was telling me the truth. Before talking to me, he had sought permission from his boss. It's possible that he was told then, make it look good for us.
Richard, taking a step back, tell us a bit about Laos as a country. As you say, it's not many people will necessarily have been. Give us a bit of the history and the context. I mean, how poor is it and how does it compare to its neighbours?
Yeah, it's a very little known and little reported story. I mean, I've been reporting on Southeast Asia for nearly 30 years. This is only the second time I've been. The first time I went was to do a different story, and it is perhaps the story for which Laos is best known. And that is that during the Vietnam War, Laos was used by the Americans, by the CIA, as a base for what's known as the secret war. So in the war against the North Vietnamese communist forces, the CIA, illegally, I think, based themselves there and used an Air Force base, actually in what's now Vang Vieng, to bomb the North Vietnamese Viet Cong as they travel through the jungle to fight South Vietnam. And one of the legacies of this has been that Laos has one of the highest concentrations of unexploded ordnance, so landmines and also cluster bombs, unexploded cluster bombs, which are scattered all over this small country. And I mean, I met a father who'd lost his 5-year-old son a few days before. They'd just been playing in the garden. They'd been digging around. They found something metallic, tried to pull it out, and it was a bomb that exploded and killed one boy and injured others. So the answer to your question is that Laos is a poor country that's had a terribly difficult history from which it's still suffering. It's a communist dictatorship, a one-party state. It's very close to China. Everywhere you go, you see any kind of big or spectacular buildings or investment, locals will tell you that's Chinese money.
And Richard, how did it go from the Vietnam War, from being effectively a war zone, from having all this unexploded ordnance, to being such a big part of the backpacker trail?
The war came to an end in the 1970s, and what had previously been known as the hippie trail, I suppose in the 80s, became the backpacker trail. So the kind of people who had been wearing caftans and had kind of oily, smelly hair, smoking big reefers, gave way to people of a similar age carrying the Lonely Planet Guide, which of course so many of us still use today. But it was the same kind of destinations that people were going to: Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia. These are extremely beautiful, very alluring countries with rich cultures, very agreeable, welcoming, gentle people, and they're also very cheap. So it's an ideal place if you're a young person with a spirit of adventure, but not much in funds. They're ideal places to go. You can spend a lot of time. Your money goes a long way. And various places, by some alchemy become established as backpacker haunts. And Vang Vieng was one of those.
And will this tragedy make a difference? I mean, do you think this is a watershed moment for the authorities, for all the restaurants and hotels and the entire industry really in Laos?
It's clearly very embarrassing for the government of Laos, but they are an authoritarian one-party state. The media is completely controlled. The only news that local people there were getting was social media. There isn't going to be a lot of pressure from public opinion within Laos itself. But clearly foreign governments are going to be concerned. And already the families, the parents of at least one of the young women, Australian women, 19, who died in this tragedy, has spoken out and said from the hospital where his daughter died that we must make sure this kind of thing can't be allowed to happen again. So I think we're going to see more pressure of that type. I have to say, over the weekend, apart from Nana Backpackers Hostel, all the other bars were open as normal.
If you're enjoying this episode of The Story, you can listen to more by subscribing to the podcast. It's completely free, and we'll put a link below in the description box for different ways you can follow us.
I'm Alasdair Gill. I'm a chef and journalist from West London.
In your time, you've also been a traveller, and you've spent a bit of time out on the backpack trail. Tell us a bit about your experiences. Tell us about arriving in Laos.
I followed, that trail as sort of most cliche teenagers do once finishing school. I went around Thailand and then went into Laos, and then I sort of really fell in love with Laos, actually. It's an amazing place, super underdeveloped, and it just felt really real. And then I suddenly arrived into Vang Vieng, and I suddenly remember feeling this thing of, wow, I'm actually kind of somewhere different now. It's kind of a bespoke sort of trashy theme park that had been made there. I mean, I think the big appeal was this thing called tubing, which, the Mekong River goes all the way down through Vang Vieng. And the gimmick is you get these big circular tubes and you sit on them and you just go down the river and you get free shots along the way.
Oh, wow.
Which, sounds amazing, but it's also an incredibly dangerous thing. I remember seeing. That was where I saw most of bad fatalities sort of happen, of casualties.
Just take us back a step. You said when you arrived in Laos, you really fell in love with it. For people who haven't been, just describe what it's like.
What's kind of amazing about it is how it felt like I'd stepped into something a bit more real. I've been in Thailand, and not that that's not amazing, but it's very swarmed. It's far more developed and it's had lots done to it, where Laos suddenly felt like you were going off the beaten path a bit more. It's the poorest country, and suddenly the people are also very different. It suddenly felt like just I'd crossed the line into a different world. It was, I think, a lot more spiritual, the people there. It's amazing sceneries of huge standalone pillars of mountains, I remember so clearly, with these sort of wispy clouds around them. And there wasn't really lots of sites of things being built there, which was so amazing. There weren't big cranes and buildings in development everywhere. And I remember being a teenager and being there thinking, wow, this is amazing. I've never seen the world like this, I remember really feeling.
And then you arrived in the town of Vang Vieng. Just describe what that's like. What were your first impressions of it?
Everyone was on the piss. It was just, Euro backpackers everywhere. But it's not a huge place. So it felt quite condensed of the people I feel that were in Vang Vieng weren't really interested in seeing the rest of Laos. They were there as the destination to go just to, to Vang Vieng, like a Benidorm or a Cavos.
So on your first day, do you head straight to the bar? What happens?
Knowing me, I could give a safe bet that yes, that was my first destination. I talk about it now as if I'm oh God, I'm so above it. I wasn't. I was young and I was this is kind of amazing too. I want to get pissed. I want to get on one of those little rubby diggy things and get down the Mekong. But it did feel like this is grim. It did feel grim. And people were getting a different kind of piss there. And that would have come directly from the alcohol that was being served there for what it was, but also just the copious amounts that they give away for free.
And when you're there, you're offered a job. Just tell us what happened.
Yeah, so I went to the bar and I remember there was the Dutch manager there who had this big handlebar moustache and long hair. and we both needed a drinking buddy. And there I was, and we started drinking, and he was like, "Yeah, we need another bartender, work." I was like, "Absolutely. I get paid in all supplies. That's I'm all for that." And he gave me a free place to stay. And he specifically was very reserved about me being English. I was so embarrassed to be English there, really. You can
Really?
just hear all the arguments, all the people yelling at the locals. It's all English accents.
And when you say yelling at the locals, just describe what are relations like with the residents?
I think it's mixed. For the foreigners who were actually staying there and doing stints and working, they were great and we were all mates and living happily together. But like I said, I think most of the tourists who aren't seeing Laos, they're coming into Vang Vieng to have this experience of getting pissed on a tube. There's an entitlement there. They're not here to see the culture. They don't care about the people. They sure as shit don't care about what their problems are. They're there to party and have a good time and treat it just sort of like a kavos. The big danger there was also that in all those other places where are known for people to go on the strip and get off their face, there's actually usually quite good safety systems set up there. I think they're probably the most staunch, fiercely working hospitals in the world around Corfu and the Greek islands, where there isn't that in Laos. And actually, when things go tits up, you suddenly realize you're quite far away from anything that's really going to help you.
Yeah.
And I think, the Westerners sort of have this thing in them, especially when you're a teenager, of thinking there are safety nets and guidelines and precautions to everything we do. Something will catch you. You don't need to care about what you're doing because something will help you if stuff goes wrong. There isn't that. And I think actually what speaks hugely to that is these deaths that have happened. They died in a Thai hospital. That says a lot. The drinking happened in Laos and they died in a Thai hospital.
Alasdair, given your experience there 10 years ago, what did you think when you saw the stories breaking in the press over the last week or so about what happened to a group of Western tourists in the same town you were in?
It's incredibly sad and tragic. It really is. And, my heart goes out to all their family, but it was really unsurprising. I was surprised that it gained this big traction because it's not new. When I was there, this was sort of known. My manager told me that someone died there every 2 weeks. I can't tell you how accurate that is, but it all added up from what I was seeing for sure, especially when you add in the activities that were there to do while you were on this sort of moonshine and drugs of going down the river.
You point out that even people who haven't taken drugs, just people who are drinking alcohol, it's a different kind of alcohol to what you'd get here. What do we know about how it's actually made? Why is it so cheap?
Well, they're just making it themselves. A classic thing would be having, the Cobra whiskey, which is what our bar had. It was this massive jar, and inside was just this king cobra in the middle.
An actual cobra?
Yeah, an actual cobra. Yeah, for sure. An actual cobra was in there.
Oh my God.
And I think, you think of it as this Westerner of like, oh, but everything's got a safety net. Everything has the precautions and is meant to be doing what they're doing. So it's all safe. Young teenagers are asleep to that, to actually where they are. And it's not their fault. Of course it's not. And it's actually hard to point to a villain in this situation of what's going on. The methanol is completely invisible and undetectable unless you have the exact sort of technology, which for sure as shit Laos does not have. The moonshine there of just homemade stuff was a different kind of drunk. I can't spot too much from the science behind it. All I know is it was being made in the bars and there was no testings or anything like that after it. Of course there wasn't. It went straight from bathtub to mouth.
And you were a teenager when you arrived. I mean, if you'd been stood in that bar now, looking around, describe the sort of people who come in. Are they all teenagers? Are they backpackers? In this case, we sort of heard about, there was a lawyer from London in her late 20s. Is that the sort of the crowd?
I think it speaks volumes to what's going on. That was the character of one of the people who tragically lost their lives. Because I think you have it in your head that it's going to be just loads of teenagers, and it is mainly, but it's people of all ages, but probably with the same kind of mindset of let's party and have a good time. There's no one there looking for the yoga retreat. Everyone is wanting to have fun and let go and push things a bit. And the dangers have showed themselves. They've always been there, and tragedy has been happening there for years. But I think it's good that it's coming to some light in the last couple of weeks.
It sounds like such a dangerous place to have been, particularly as a teenager, with so many things going wrong around you. And as you said, no real safety net, no great hospitals, nothing nearby if anything went horribly wrong. How did you end up leaving? How did your time there come to an end?
The place just got shut down. There was a bust up, and we all got sort of taken to the local authorities, and I did a night in a Laos prison cell. But I think so much of this danger is, within how we conduct ourselves. This shouldn't put people off going to Laos. It's a beautiful place, and it's an amazing people, and it's full of culture, and it's a wonderful, wonderful country. It doesn't mean don't go there. It means screw your head on and just understand what the situation is and what the dangers are and what has been happening there.
Our thanks to the chef, writer and former barman Alasdair Gill and the Asia editor of The Times and The Sunday Times, Richard Lloyd Parry. The producer today was Chris Wade, the executive producer was Fiona Leach, and sound design and theme composition were by Mal Lassetto. If you can, please do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.